Enjoyed your lunch. Welcome to our second session. It was meant to be 3 speakers, we are down to 2, but no, they are amazing, so that's fine. So we have Commemoration and Forgetting, and you have 2 speakers, starting with Kirsty, who... James does go first. Thank you, Kirsty. I'm not ready. Let's try that again. Welcome to James, who is completing his PhD at the University of Hull, and is going to be talking about British child migrants in Australia. And then we have Kirsty, thank you, who has just completed her MA here at the University of York, and she is going to be talking about representations of the Northern Irish conflict. So without further ado, they will speak one after the other, and then I will host some questions, no doubt, that you'll have at the end. So, James, off to you.
Thanks very much indeed. As mentioned, my name is James. Thank you all for joining me for my talk this afternoon. The topic of today's talk will address the historic failures to care for the thousands of British orphans deported to Australia during the 20th century, with a focus on the extent to which the representations of this history have adequately addressed the trauma suffered by child migrants in Australia. A brief content warning at the beginning: references are made to the maltreatment suffered by child migrants, so viewer discretion is advised throughout. Before we begin with the context of child migration, I want to firstly address some of the key terms around this general kind of area of study. As Adele Chenoweth said in her 2013 TED Talk on childhood experiences in care, Australia has quite possibly the highest rates of institutionalisation of children in the world. There were roughly 500,000 living in care during the 20th century alone. And the first 3 groups behind me are known collectively as wards of state, or former wards of the Australian state. Although the term Forgotten Australians sometimes refers to all children who were raised in care during this time, it more commonly refers to the non-Indigenous and Australian-born children within this cohort. The stolen generations were victims of historic Indigenous child removal throughout much of the 20th century. Today's talk focuses on the experiences of British child migrants in Australia. Although it's commonly estimated that around 7,000 British orphans were deported to Australia between circa 1913 to 1970, as you can see behind me, estimates on this exact number do vary quite drastically from governmental reports. And lastly, the £10 POMs, or £10 immigrants, were voluntary adults and family migrants who arrived in Australia after the end of the Second World War. So the vast majority of children who would become British child migrants came from working class, largely urban backgrounds. Here the word orphans in its historical context refers to children who have had one or more parents pass away rather than both. So that's a different meaning of the word orphan in this historical context. Effectively, the UK government deemed these child migrants, or future child migrants, to be undesirable. They deemed urban poverty to be something of a social ill at the time, regrettably. And they encouraged and helped to bankroll charities and religious orders to take care of these children and later deport them out of the country altogether with the promise of a better life, which, as we'll see, did not come to fruition for most of these children. There were also imperial and racist underpinnings of these policies, with the UK wishing to increase the ethnically white population of its overseas colonies, Australia wishing to do the same as well for their own population during these years. Even after the end of the Second World War, the creation of the welfare state and the abolition of the Poor Law, child migrant schemes accelerated, with working class orphans being all but overlooked within the process of post-war reconstruction. In 1986, Nottingham-based social worker Margaret Humphreys received a letter from a child migrant called Mary. She recalled her early childhood in Nottingham. She recalled being put on a boat to Australia at the age of 6 and asked Margaret Humphreys desperately, "Please, can you help me find my mother?" Humphreys successfully reunited her and roughly 1,000 former child migrants with their families over the past 3 or 4 decades, although others sadly were not so lucky. While in the process of tracing these lost families and searching for family records, Humphreys discovered the cruel, shocking and repugnant maltreatment inflicted upon child migrants. This included, but was not limited to, sexual, physical and emotional abuse, children being used as a source of forced labour, children experiencing a loss of personal identity due to many being given false birth certificates, names, or even numbers upon arrival to Australia, and children being falsely told that their parents had died or no longer wanted to look after them. The following year, Margaret Humphreys established the Child Migrants Trust as a support group for victims of historic child deportation from the UK. Their campaign centre around the 3 themes of reparations, recognition and rights, with the theme of recognition being central to today's talk. So the aims of my talk today are fourfold. I will firstly and briefly address the marginalisation of children within public history and history more generally. It will then turn to look at the role of childhood within national reconciliation, within apologies, and will then turn to look at the link between public history and this process of apology with reference to British child migrants sent to Australia. It will lastly look at the key theme today of the extent to which child migrants can be given a voice within this process, notably a chance to discuss the trauma they suffered in childhood. So there are, I believe, a number of reasons as to why childhood has been largely neglected within public history and history at large. If we look at academics like Shirley Swain, she's explained that historically, and to a lesser extent today, the identities and historical narratives of childhood are bound up or were bound up within the context of family, most notably the nuclear family. Other historical institutions and sites of learning have historically been reluctant to represent traumatic or institutional experiences of childhood within their exhibitions, including the National Museum of Australia, until the advent of national apologies for the maltreatments of former wards of state. We also see, according to Karen Sanchez-Epler, to a large extent, children being written about rather than being the subject of historical inquiries. As you can imagine, all of these factors are highly problematic for British child migrants in imperial outposts such as Australia. So globally and historically, fewer than 5% of national governmental apologies have addressed wrongdoings perpetrated against children. As you can see, the UK has only issued one such apology to former child migrants in 2010, being the only out of 24 national apologies given overall. Australia, though, is something of an exception to this general rule, with 4 out of 5 of their national apologies being related to childhood or apologising for wrongdoing perpetrated against children, especially while in the care of the state. Of course, their apology to the stolen generations overlaps with their attempts to reconcile with historic injustices faced by First Nation Australians. However, aside from a statement of regret by then Prime Minister John Howard for the subjugation of Indigenous Australians, this apology for Indigenous child removal remains the only apology, or full apology, given to First Nation Australians by the federal government. The following year, they would issue a joint apology to the forgotten Australians and child migrants, so all non-Indigenous former wards of the state. The subject and the issue of the public representation of the history of child migrant programs really came into focus during the end of the late 1990s and the turn of the new millennium. Prior to this point, there had been a handful of disparate and small-scale attempts to represent this history in the public sphere, notably the 1992 television series The Leaving of Liverpool. However, the UK and Australian federal governments both issued national inquiries into child migrant programs around this time, both of which noted the noticeable lack of public history concerning the experience of child deportees in imperial outposts. Australia's report went a step further in recommending the creation of a $100,000 fund to create 6 memorials in each of Australia's 6 devolved states dedicated to child migrants, each of which were constructed between 2001 and 2007. Memorialisation represented the principal form of telling the story within the public sphere during the first decade of the new millennium. As you can see behind me though, these memorials were intended to focus on the achievements and contributions of child migrants while overlooking the trauma and historic failures to which they were subjected throughout their lives. Behind me are 2 examples out of the 6 Australian memorials which were created to recognise former child migrants. On the left is the South Australian Memorial found at the Migration Museum in Adelaide, South Australia. It recognises all child migrants, including those who arrived before government-backed programs in the 19th century, and addresses the fact that these were children on the move. It says they were innocent children and talks somewhat about their vulnerability. However, the focus largely rests on these children as parents, as workers, and their pursuits of personal identity. This overlooks the fact that many children were given false names, false identities upon arrival, and were therefore unable to fully trace their family lineage and their remaining relatives in the UK. On the right is Western Australia's memorial dedicated to child migrants, found in Fremantle, which was in itself a point of arrival for thousands of voluntary and non-voluntary British immigrants to Australia throughout the previous centuries. As you can see, the sculpture represents the sadness, the sorrow, and the vulnerability associated with familial separation and forced deportation. However, the dedication underneath this sculpture is rather more passive and almost celebratory of child migrant programs. It states that these children left their homelands, overlooking the fact that this was in fact a forced deportation and a forced child removal from the UK. It also contains the phrase, hardships were endured, benefits were derived, failing to understand what exactly these hardships were, not addressing the failures of government and charity in caring for these children, and focusing instead on those who were able to overcome adversity, a far from universal experience, sadly, for former child migrants. Behind me is the only British memorial dedicated to either child migrants or child migrant schemes, found in Nottingham, which today is the home of the Child Migrants Trust. As you can see behind me, it discusses the fact that these children were in fact deported. It accepts the fact this was a forced removal of children, but instead focuses on only post-war child migrants and talks about the role of Nottinghamshire County Council in providing funding for the Child Migrants Trust in tracing families. There was a further turning point in 2009 and 2010 when both national governments issued apologies, at least in part, to former child migrants. Australia's apology, issued by then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, promised an increased amount of funding for museum and library projects dedicated at least in part to former child migrants. The UK issued no similar guarantees, instead viewing their own apology as a memorial moment in and of itself. However, what we do see in the years following these apologies is an increase in both the number and variety of types of different public history projects dedicated to former child migrants. What we also see, as we'll see shortly, is the child migrant story merging into wider historical narratives. It was largely deemed to be a separate story. In Australia, for example, it's often used as a case study to discuss wider issues of institutional experiences of childcare in Australia, and in the UK, it's often used as a case study to discuss forced British deportation, especially within an imperial context, as we'll see. So behind me are the first of 4 case studies highlighting the diversification of child migrant heritage post-apology. This is another Western Australian memorial dedicated to all former wars of state, including British child migrants. It represents, as you can see, a children's fortune-telling game and contains written testimonies across the memorial itself, outlining adults' reflection on experiences in institutional childcare, some of which refer to the child migrant experience. Some testimonies include, "I thought my parents were dead, they were not, and my name was once a number," some of which do refer to the unique experiences faced by child migrants. References at the base of the memorial are also made to child migrant homes, including Fairbridge, Bindoon and Clontarf, all of which were found in the state of Western Australia. In January of this year, I had the chance to visit the Migration Museum in London to look at their Departures exhibition, focusing on British emigration away from the UK. The exhibition contained a display dedicated to British deportees entitled Forced to Leave, and included other case studies, notably victims of the Windrush scandal, Jewish refugees deported to Australia in 1940, as well as convict migrants, especially female and child convict migrants, also deported to Australia. Although the text on the display itself addressed the maltreatment of child migrants and the trauma suffered by parents as a result of separation from their children, the display heavily featured imagery used historically to promote child migrant programs. Behind me is an image taken at Tilbury Docks in London in 1948 and was used in pamphlets and posters to publicise and promote the supposed virtues of child migrants, giving them what was deemed to be a new start. However, behind the display were a series of audio booths containing interviews with British emigrants away from the UK, people who were forced to leave their homeland for various reasons. One of which was former child migrant Cliff Walsh. His interview was part of a wider podcast series conducted by the museum. His testimony, as you can see, discusses some of the horrors of child migration, including his deportation and forced familial separation in the UK, as well as institutional abuse and forced labour he was subjected to while in Australia, as alluded to in the quote behind me. Arguably the most famous example of the public history of child migrant programmes is the 2011 film Oranges and Sunshine, directed by Jim Loach and starring Emily Watson in the role of Margaret Humphreys. The film begins with Humphreys meeting Mary, as mentioned earlier, and depicts their successful reunion with her mother. The film largely focuses on Humphreys herself, her creation of the Child Migrants Trust, and the many difficulties she faced in tracing lost child migrant families. Some mention is also made of the trauma suffered by child migrants, including familial separation, a loss of identity, and the passing of family members prior to having the chance to reunite. Stories of forced labour and institutional abuse only become apparent in the latter stages of the film. And lastly, the National Library of Australia conducted over 200 interviews with forgotten Australians, child migrants and their advocates in the 3 years following the issuing of the joint federal apology. 116 in total were placed online, 30 of which were conducted with former child migrants. A range of topics were discussed in these exchanges, including Patricia Carlson, a child migrant, explaining the heartache of never being able to meet her birth parents due to their recent passing at the time. Meanwhile, Michael Harvey, Dilys Budd and Maurice Crawford-Raby all offered critiques of the Australian and UK apologies based on their own experiences and trauma living in institutional care in Australia. So in conclusion, I believe that childhood remains largely marginalised in both public history and national reconciliation more generally, in spite of Australia placing a strong emphasis on childhood within national reconciliation, and the UK apologising directly to child migrants in 2010, child migrant heritage remains largely fragmentary, is often placed within wider historical narratives, and frequently overlooks the trauma they suffered in childhood, in addition to the institutional and governmental failures of care, many of whom experienced while in Australia and in the UK prior to their deportation. Thanks very much for listening.
Hello everybody. I think I need a nervous pee, but I'll be okay. Hello everybody live streaming as well. It's so nice to see you all. As Hannah alluded to earlier, my name is Kirsty O'Rourke and I have just finished my Masters in Public History at the University of York. Last time I said that I got a cheer, but okay. I'm here to present on my dissertation topic, and that is how English military and war museums represent the Northern Irish conflict. So let me give you some context on why I think this research is important. In recent years, the stability of Northern Ireland has come under scrutiny, from discussions on Brexit and the hard border to conversations on protecting veterans from prosecution for actions taken in the Troubles. The optimism surrounding the peace process and reconciliation in Northern Ireland has apparently been undermined. This has been blamed on multiple things, including English ignorance of Irish history, which is where my presentation comes in. Here's the thing on my structure, but I don't want to waste any time, so have a wee look. Isn't it lovely? There we go. So, my introduction. There is an issue within England on the knowledge of Irish history, especially on the Troubles. In the curriculum, there is nothing that recommends teaching this across all key stages, and only 1 out of the 4 main GCSE exam specification mentions the possibility of teaching the Troubles for their exam. It is not a topic often learned within English education, as I'm sure some of you will attest to. So where else can you learn about this conflict? Well, Natalia Danilova and Candida Parnell have argued that military museums play a critical role in the meaning-making of Britain's wars. Also, the British government have set up initiatives in cultural and education institutions, including museums, to improve the public image of the British Armed Forces. Therefore, not only are military museums a place in which the public learn about wars, but it is also a place used by the government to improve image. Yet, these museums appear to have received limited critical attention, and the role of curators in these museums have been underexplored in the literature. So this is where my presentation comes in. Through interviews with museum professionals and assessing museums in England, this research has found that there appear specific restrictions that museum professionals face when representing the Troubles, and that this works to create specific narratives of this conflict as internal. So I know there's a few English in the audience today, let me give you some context on Ireland. The Troubles in Northern Ireland lasted from 1968 to 1998. It was the longest continuous campaign for the British Army. This conflict is heavily intertwined with themes of plantations, colonialism, sectarianism, and nationalism, and its origin massively predates 1968. But anyway, in 1968, there was a civil rights campaign in Northern Ireland as a response to the discrimination Catholics faced. This led to the British government deploying their security forces. The aim of the army was to protect the Catholic population. However, through their lack of cultural understanding and ineptitude, it caused an increase of support against the British Army. Not only this, but there was an increase of support for paramilitary groups, both loyalist and Republican. The Troubles may have officially ended in 1998 with the Good Friday Agreement, but the impact of this conflict can still be seen today in the island of Ireland and mainland Britain through religious discrimination by the police service of Northern Ireland, to a community arts festival chanting pro-IRA slogans, all the way to an Irish footballer playing in England who was sent bullets in the post. The legacy of this conflict is not over. As I alluded to earlier, my sources include museum exhibitions and interviews, The 5 museums I analysed were the Imperial War Museum, National Army Museum, the Fusilier Museum in Bury, York Army Museum and the Cheshire Military Museum. If you have any questions why, please ask me at the end because I have reasons. I also interviewed 5 museum professionals, the majority of which wanted to remain anonymous. Therefore, I've anonymised everyone, but I do think the anonymous thing's interesting. So from these interviews, I was able to learn about the restrictions museum professionals faced, to see if these restrictions were solely found in representing the Troubles, and if museum professionals found similar or different restrictions to each other. On the board, we can see the main restrictions that came out of these interviews. I absolutely naively came into these interviews thinking, oh grand, all these curators are going to say the same thing and it will back up the literature and I have my argument. But apparently they're independent people, so they didn't. There were people that said there's not enough objects. There's not enough military objects. Other people said there's more than enough objects. That wasn't a limitation for me. Some argued that funding from the Ministry of Defence limited them hugely. And others said that they took the Ministry of Defence with a pinch of salt. So, with such limited time, I want to talk about those things that came up time and time again, including audience. So while restrictions of audience ranged from catering for schools to catering for tourists, one came up time and time again, and this is the regimental family. The regimental family includes those that served, but also their friends and family. Museum professionals stated that they didn't want to cause upset or embarrassment to them. Most interviewees stated that this audience limited their ability to approach exhibiting this history in a critical manner. And what theme came out of this cautiousness? It was how sensitive the history of the Troubles is. Mainly because it's in such recent memory. Maybe because it's just across the seas, it's our next door neighbour. But this is sensitive. 4 out of 5 of my interviewees explained that they had limited education on Ireland, especially the Troubles. And one person said, nobody really knows much about Ireland. What they did know, however, was that this history is polarising. One of my interviewees mentioned the fear of being bombed for presenting it incorrectly. And also, they all noted it as complicated. One of my interviewees said, exhibiting the Troubles is like walking a tightrope, which I think is a great quote. A great way to sort of show this is in one example that I found. A museum professional discussed with me their desire to exhibit a rubber bullet. A rubber bullet was created by the Ministry of Defence as a non-lethal way to control riots in Northern Ireland. However, the rubber, and now plastic bullet, caused 17 deaths, 16 of whom were Catholic and 8 of whom were children from as young as 10. It is a controversial object. While still controversial, it is in use today in Northern Ireland. So what did the Board of Trustees say to this museum professional? Well, in her own words, this is not my pun, it was a point-blank no, she said. No, apparently, they stated that we're not showing any of the aggression. However, as the museum professional noted, they were able to display weapons in other exhibitions, able to display aggression in other conflicts. So what makes the Troubles different? Okay, we've talked a wee bit about the restrictions that curators face. So with these restrictions, what can they show? What are the representations? Well, from my research, I found that the main narrative presented was of Northern Ireland and the Troubles as a sectarian internal conflict with the British state as a neutral umpire. From analysing my 5 museums, Imperial War, National Army, York Army, Cheshire Military and Fusiliers Bury, I found that this narrative was constructed through 3 ways. First, through leaving out context surrounding the Troubles. The museum professionals interviewed mentioned that they found contextualising the Troubles difficult, maybe through limited space, through the complicated history. What do you include? What don't you include? However, through omitting this context, they start to present the Troubles as an isolated, unique event and extract it from any themes of colonialism. Both the nationalist and unionist narratives in Ireland rely on this longer narrative. The widely sung nationalist song, Going Home British Soldiers, released during the Troubles, includes the lyrics, "For 800 years we fought you without fear, and will fight you for 800 more." The unionist narrative in the Troubles also relied on events in the past, such as the Battle of the Boyne in 1690 and the Act of Union in 1801. They've utilised all of this history for their identity. It is hundreds of years in the making. Yet military museums do not provide this context, and all the museums assessed, bar the York Army Museum, place the Troubles in a totally separate, distant place. They all followed a similar order: colonialism, the World Wars, but colonialism didn't exist by then, guys, and then modern warfare and counterinsurgency, which is where the Troubles fell. It was presented as something distinct from anything previous. Introducing context can begin to help bring in more narratives about the Troubles. So yes, we have the internal sectarian conflict, but there's another theme of colonialism. There's a different theme that comes in, including the British state as an actor. The Imperial Wars website begins to do this on their webpage. What you need to know about the Troubles. They give context of the 1916 Easter Rising and the partition of Ireland. They even talk about tracing the origins back to the 17th century. However, when they discuss this, they state that two groups emerged in the 17th century, one Catholic and one Protestant. They don't explain how they emerged. They don't discuss plantations. It seems a more fluid process that went on. Okay, so maybe these museums aren't necessarily giving context about the Troubles. But what do they actually say about the Troubles? How are they presenting it? I hear you cry. Well, as you can see on the board, my second one, I have titled it Peacekeeping Between Two Warring Tribes. Melinda Sutton has stated that this has become the dominant narrative of the Troubles, and multiple historians have all noted that because of this, the role of the British state has been frequently omitted from public discourse. Both the Imperial War and National Army continually refer to the British Army as peacekeepers throughout their exhibition. York Army, Cheshire Military and Fusiliers Berry don't necessarily do this. However, they do present objects, photos or writings of the Troubles alongside ones about the United Nations. For example, this is the Fusiliers Museum in Berry, which presents uniform from the Troubles, a map of Belfast, right next to uniform of the UN and the UN flag. The title next to this is Preserving the Peace. As Jan Bloma and Chris Balkin have explained, when different topics are presented simultaneously, it affects how they are perceived individually. The British Army is beginning to appear neutral. Furthermore, I don't know if I can get back on the slide, so we're going to be stuck on this one. The conflict has been shown in these museums as solely between Catholics and Protestants. Terms like religious tensions spilling over and a sectarian conflict were repeated time and time again, with little room for other factors to be discussed. This can be seen in their focus on conflict and casualties. In all of them, the main focus on conflict and casualties is paramilitary violence and dealing with terrorism. It centres violence between paramilitary organisations as sectarian groups as the main conflict. In the Imperial Wars physical exhibition, they have oral history accounts playing. Each one is a British soldier discussing sectarianism and paramilitary organisations. The Imperial War Museum does hold other oral histories that discuss the violence of the British Army in Northern Ireland, but they don't include these. When discussing casualties, these museums talk about civilians killed by paramilitaries or those of the British Army killed by these groups too. Only the National Army Museum talks about those killed by the British Army. They state that 306 people were killed by the British Army, 56% of which were non-combatant civilians. This tiny nugget of information begins to tell the theme of British state violence in the Troubles. It adds an extra narrative. So, unfortunately, I've not been able to go into every finding. However, overall, in my dissertation, I found that museum professionals face more restrictions when it comes to exhibiting the Troubles than it does with other conflicts. The representation that these museums then present becomes a singular narrative of it as an internal conflict between two warring sectarian tribes, in which the British state is neutral. And now, because I've seen I've got some time, I'm going to say something else. I remember doing this, the research for it, and I had the amazing Dr. Jeffrey Cubitt as my supervisor, and his knowledge was invaluable. But he asked me one question, and it made me mad. I now realise he was just trying to help me, but it did make me mad. And he was like, why does England need to know about this? Why does England need to know about this for reconciliation with it? And I was like, excuse me, of course they do. But now I just want to open it up a wee bit. I know it's different to what I said, but we so often place reconciliation to be something done in Northern Ireland, something done between these two warring tribes, these two communities. But as we've seen recently with comments from Boris Johnson, like the tail's wagging the dog when he talks about the Republic of Ireland, it's not the case. There is clearly tension between the mainland Britain, Northern Ireland, and the Republic of Ireland. We need to start presenting this history as more than just two warring tribes, because that's why we think reconciliation needs to happen there. Let's talk about how the British state was an actor. Let's talk about how the Republic of Ireland was an actor. Involve these governments, involve the people within, because they were involved. So this is my thing. This is my side note, which I don't think I wrote in my dissertation, is that if English military and war museums start presenting this extra narrative, this extra story, maybe it will help us to understand how big the reconciliation process should be. Now that I've absolutely riffed that, and you can totally tear it about, I'll say thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James and Kirsty. They were very thought-provoking and very interesting. Well done, guys. I'll open it up to questions on the floor now. Change my screen. I said I would come here first.
Thank you both of you. It was very, very interesting. My question is to Kirsty. I presume you're probably expecting this, knowing that I'm a big fan of military history as well. I completely agree with you that Northern Ireland isn't represented in pretty much any military history museum that I've ever been to or worked in. I suppose my question is, do you think the rest of the UK, England in particular, should direct their reconciliation in the same manner that Germany has with Holocaust memory, and potentially there should be a more national exhibition or museum, particularly focusing on the Northern Ireland conflict as a way of commemorating this, rather than individual military history museums, which might be a lot harder for them to get a sort of combined narrative on the topic?
Yeah, so obviously that was a whistle-stop tour, and I think, I at least hope, that I am very aware in my writing that actually these regimental museums face a lot of restrictions, of space, of money, of objects, all of these things. And sometimes they feel they're not in the place to be able to do it, which is, I suppose, understandable, but for me, I still think, well, it's because I like the whole conflict. I don't like it. That was terrible. But maybe they could put a wee bit more in. I think comparing it to sort of Holocaust education, I don't know. I think Britain has more of an issue with decolonisation, which I think Northern Ireland should be a part of. And that's what I really think. I think Northern Ireland should be a part of these decolonisation efforts. And maybe they should have museums purely based on like certain aspects of it. I don't know. I don't know if there's a lot of space. I don't know if there's a lot of funding for it. But I just think that Northern Ireland should be pulled into that conversation. I think they've been, well, the whole of Ireland has been left out of it, it's been looking further afield, but there's definitely a gap there. So basically, short answer, I don't know.
Thank you both, James and Kirsty, for your wonderful presentations. My question is to both of you. You both talked about representation in museums, offered critiques of these representations. If you were a museum curator who is tasked with representing these communities, what would an ideal representation in that institution look like for you?
Excellent question. I think, as mentioned, the kind of big issue for me is that child migrants are often part of a wider narrative. So the earliest example of a kind of, or second earliest rather, of a museum exhibition was called Inside, Life in Children's Homes and Institutions, which jointly recognised all wards of state and was kind of designed to look like a children's institution, very unusually enough. So there's been different approaches in each example. With the Migration Museum, I don't know if you went, but it meant to look like a departure lounge in an airport, so kind of representing the kind of migration. With child migration, it's such a kind of wide topic. There's obviously, as mentioned, issues about class, about empire, about race. So it's hard to know where exactly to focus on because it's such a broad topic and has, as mentioned, been placed into a wider narrative. So I think, for me, on the one hand, Britain needs to do far more in terms of representing this story, especially in museum context, and what the Migration Museum did well was actually to kind of create resources designed to teach this topic alongside other case studies of forced deportation. So I think for me, there has to be kind of a link between formal education of this, in whatever way that may take, alongside kind of public representation. But in a museum context, I think that's been an understanding of the kind of wider historical context about social deprivation, social welfare, empire, and the kind of aftermath. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but certainly has to be a much wider focus on all of these key issues that have been largely, in my opinion, overlooked within a museum context.
Yeah, so he did a very good answer. I don't know how mine will go. I think, and this came up from a lot of the interviews that I had with museum professionals, is that we need to talk to the communities a lot more. So communities within England, within the local area that are Irish communities, have a discussion with them. How did the events that were going on, if they were living here, how did that affect them, and how people looked at them and assessed them and judged them, because there was huge judgment of Irish communities in the Troubles. And also having these discussions with communities in Northern Ireland as well. This is very much stretching people's resources, but if you could, having these discussions with those in Northern Ireland, because it is a polarising history. I think we can see that today. There's so many things coming out, so many other parts of the conflict still impacting us. But I think to create, I don't know if you can use the word good, museum exhibition, because they were grand exhibitions, is by getting communities involved. Because my museum professionals very much told me up front, I don't know about the Troubles. And I think if you don't know, ask.
Thank you very much. If I had imaginary millions, I would fund those projects. I'm going to go over here. Excuse my clip-cloppy shoes.
Thank y'all both for the presentations. They were really nice. My question specifically for James. So, to be frank, my background's in computer science and history, so it's kind of a computer sciencey question. So, with you talking about migrants, especially finding families, it made me think a lot about like DNA testing. So I don't know if you looked into this a lot, I was just curious, but do you think with like the increase now in like DNA accessibility and with public being able to test, it's brought more attention to this for people that like didn't realize they had living relatives or something, if they got tested and found this whole rest of their family tree they had no idea about? And I was just wondering if that was something you even like kind of saw while you were researching.
Oh, it's fascinating. Thank you for your question. It's not something that I've come across directly in my own research. I think looking kind of at my own topic, part of the issue with child migrants especially is a lot of records don't exist. So even if child migrants eventually find out what their real name was, or if they had a name in the first place, or are given their full birth certificates, a lot of records or family trees about their birth in the UK or their experiences of care either in the UK or in Australia don't exist. So there's always kind of stumbling blocks to them personally kind of tracing their kind of ancestry. So you're absolutely right. I think DNA testing is a kind of fascinating kind of case study and has brought to attention the issue of kind of family tracing and lineage. But for child migrants, it's highly limited because what they really need is kind of, you know, their what we consider to be very basic and very fundamental records, the things that kind of make them human in many ways. Their birth certificates are proof of who their parents are. I think without that, many of them have sadly struggled or found out too late who their birth parents or siblings were in later life. So thank you for your question.
Thank you both. Quick question about the feel-good history, because I think that's something you're touching on, and the fact that people in institutions, public funding, they want feel-good history, right? We don't want to know about the bad stuff we've done. And it's not specific to the UK or French people have their share of bad stuff. So my question is, where public history? Is it possible to have a not feel-good history in a public funding institution? Or should we create new frameworks, like moving from a monument to a digital monument online, where you have more control and rely less on the feel-good spirit from politicians and money? So do you think that we should keep asking museums, public museums, to do the not to feel good? Or should we create new frameworks to do public history?
Shall I go first? I don't mind. So just excellent question again. Speaking kind of in my area, museums exhibitions related to child migration alongside other demographics. For example, the National Museum of Australia created a blog, a kind of digital kind of area where child migrants, adult care leavers, relatives can actually discuss their experiences in care. But the blog was shut down the day the exhibition launched, so it was very limited until the exhibition actually started. You couldn't actually, or after it started, you couldn't actually contribute to it. I think for me, there's very little feel-good in my topic. It is a topic defined by institutional failure, governmental failure, unspeakable cruelty. And yes, there are child migrants who've overcome adversity, who've raised families, but a lot of child migrants have sadly suffered with addictions, psychiatric disorders, haven't been able to find their families. So I think it's very hard to create any kind of positive kind of outlook. Obviously reconciliation is happening, but there are limitations with both apologies, and only recently have issues such as reparation come into focus. So I think with Australia it's quite unique because as a result of the pandemic, I've had to look at more creative resources. In Australia there is a website called Monuments Australia, which you saw earlier on, and there are other digital repositories where people can look at statues, can kind of find markers dedicated to certain areas of history. So there is something of a transition there, and there is, for example, with the Migration Museum, a series of podcasts, some blogs, and kind of more digital and kind of more, I guess, non-traditional means of engaging with this history. So it is progressing. I think it does need to happen in terms of a digital turn in this area, but it's kind of happening very gradually, I think, for me.
Yeah, so I also agree, digital turn, and this would be great. There's loads of projects at the moment, like Sense and the Troubles, which I would say anybody looking at should do that, because that's very cool. I think my issue is that there are sort of feel-good representations of the Troubles. I say that in the loosest sense of the term. But you've got Derry Girls. It's a fantastic show. It shows the lives of these 5 girls. I'll get it right. And that's great. But okay, so there's something online that you could look at that gives these representations of sort of harder topics. The people that I want it to reach won't necessarily go out of their way to find these things. I think from the literature, you know I love theory, Thomas, they found that military museums is where a lot of the English public make meaning of their wars, and it is where a lot of the English public that are proud of their history go. And I think that's probably why it's difficult to create such a critical approach, because you don't want to turn your audience away. But I think that's where it's needed most. Because the people that are interested in the bad stuff, they're gonna go and look for it. They're gonna watch these documentaries, these films. They will find it online. Someone will share it with them. But the people that won't, let's sneak attack them in the museums.
Sneak attack history. Alright, anyone else for a question? I'm going to come at the front here.
Thanks both of you, they were very interesting presentations. This relates more directly to the Irish one, but I suppose it counts for both of you. But for instance, recently I saw the film Belfast, which was my first kind of introduction visually to the Troubles, although my parents had memories of living in England and hearing every day about what was going on in Ireland. And I was wondering how important, and it kind of goes with child migration as well, you have films like Philomena, where a woman's child is taken from her because she was being forced to live with nuns and they took her child because it was illegitimate and she found out he died. And it set off quite a chain reaction to forced separation. But how important do you think films are, in like cinemas and such, to representing or portraying these events to the public, especially if, say, those films get shortlisted and win Oscars?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think films are really important. I did a different presentation once, guys, and that was on the representation of victims of genocide in films and how that can aid reconciliation. I think films are incredible. I think that because they use sight, sound, camera angles, discussion, but also silence, they're able to give this audience an experiential way to learn it, while also putting across complex characters, complex narratives in an easily digestible way, which Victoria will remember saying this to me, and I keep quoting it wherever I go. But yes, I think films are really, really important, but I didn't do it on Northern Ireland, so I will pass it over now.
Thanks very much. So I don't know if I mentioned or not in my presentation, but Orange and the Sunshine is currently the only film representation of this narrative. It's an incredibly powerful film. I remember watching it before beginning my PhD, I think a few months before, and it was incredibly moving to see. It was slightly adapted because the film itself, in reality, Mary sent a letter to Margaret Humphreys. In the film, she meets her at one of her support group sessions and meets her there and says, "Please can you help me find my mother?" And it's an incredible story because it represents kind of Humphreys' initial own disbelief of the issue, like how could this be such a clandestine policy? How were children deported for so long without any kind of public awareness? It kind of progresses to Humphreys going out to Australia, setting up offices in Melbourne and Perth, I believe, and there being, queues around the corner of migrants wanting to meet or find out about their birth families. And it also talks about her own issues with losing touch with her own family. I think one part of the film, she misses Christmas and her own children are very angry at her because she's out in Australia meeting child migrants. So it talks about her own personal struggles too. So it's an incredibly useful film. I mentioned that it focuses a lot more on Humphreys and it's only really apparent about child migrants, but that happens later on. I think that what's been kind of more abundant at the very least is TV programmes. I don't know how many of you watched the episode of Long Lost Family that referenced child migrants, but that was also very powerful. It featured an interview with Margaret Humphreys and the case study of this man called Dorian meeting his great nephew and niece was very kind of bittersweet. His kind of mission in life was to finally meet his father, and sadly he passed away in the 80s, so they told him that thankfully off camera. But he managed to be greeted with a set of his father's old bowling balls. He saw him playing with the bowling balls at the end of the episode and him connecting with what his father once used for recreation. So there's been a lot more abundance of TV, and certainly Orange and the Sunshine was a pretty big deal at the time. It got a lot of mainstream publicity. I think it was premiered at the Cannes Film Festival, I believe, in 2011, and obviously Jim Loach being from the Loach dynasty, a very famous family of filmmakers, so it had a great kind of global reach too. So I hope it's the first of a few that bring us to attention this topic on the kind of silver screen.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to Hannah and then Jeff.
Thank you, those were two very excellent presentations. This is a question for James, but I think might have relevance to you. Are you able to clarify a little bit about the British apology. So from what I'm understanding from what you're saying, this is obviously not an area that I'm very knowledgeable about, is it feels like it's very much seen as an like Australian problem. Like, we deported these children, but you know, that's your problem to deal with in Australia. And I think that speaks to something that you said about decolonisation, that it's very much seen as a you problem, that's not a me problem. And I was just kind of thinking about this in terms of decolonisation, and it's not really a question, I guess, it's just a statement about how much of this needs to be brought back into British colonialism, and these are very much two different ends of this kind of the colonial spectrum of just violence against everybody, everywhere. Yeah, basically.
No, it's a fantastic point. With the British apology, there was a brief mention of the fact that child migrants were sent to Australia, as well as Canada, the former Rhodesia, and New Zealand. And it mentioned the fact that child migrants fought in the world wars. But there's very little about colonialism or empire in the apology itself. It was much more about kind of understanding the failures of governments that led to this happening. And it is framed as a failure of the British government. It is there is some language in there that's rather passive in saying that you were let down, you were, kind of subjected to horrible maltreatment while in care, but it is still framed very much as a British kind of policy failure. It is an interesting kind of thing because the Australian apology as well was much more focused on experiences of childhood rather than being a kind of forced imperial settlement, with it being a joint apology. And with the UK, there were not the same level of promises of so Australia promised, although more kind of wide-ranging policies, things like counselling and family tracing services, public history. So with the British apology, it was, for me, having studied it, a lot more about the actual ceremony and the day. The speech was very short, it was very emotive, and was directed to child migrants as former wards of the British states and as children who were failed by the UK, not as much as a kind of failure of empire. But what it did do quite well, and a lot of child migrants had actually said, was that Gordon Brown very kindly met with each child migrant who attended. There were 40 in total. He held a reception and actually met them one-to-one and let their voices be heard in that context. So it was very powerful for a lot of these child migrants, many of whom still see themselves as being British, despite the fact this country has done very little, if nothing, for them.
Are they entitled to British citizenship now?
It depends, because they're entitled to Australian citizenship because the Child Migrants Trust waived the application fee for child migrants, and a lot of them would have been residents rather than citizens because they didn't have the right documentation. The answer is very grey. It depends. It depends on whether there's proof of a relative living in the UK, whether there's proof of parents, and automatically they aren't British citizens, sadly. They're entitled to some form of financial reparations and redress, but to the best of my knowledge, there's not been any automatic schemes to qualify them as UK nationals. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, so it speaks to further colonial failings of the citizenship in this country.
Yes, definitely.
And then, it's you problem again, like, sorry, you can't come back. Sorry, terrible.
No, of course. I mean, with the literature, it's often written about as a kind of forced imperial settlement, but not as much in the public sphere as being a kind of forced imperial project or a failure of empire. So the apology all but overlooks this kind of concept of colonialism. I think to its detriment to a large degree in terms of actually understanding this was a kind of a racially motivated and forced imperial settlement using children as this kind of almost a resource, a kind of dehumanized resource to kind of further the imperial project.
Thank you. We are swiftly running out of time, so I'm going to have to say the last question is for Joe.
Thanks. This one is for James as well, because Kirsty's had too many questions for me.
Thank goodness, I was really worried.
One you mentioned earlier. It's really a question about sort of descriptive terminology in a way, and I think it links to what's just been said. I mean, I was really struck with your first really helpful kind of slide by this contrast between these terms, stolen generations and forgotten Australians, which are sort of heavily emotionally laden sort of terms. And on the other hand, there's rather neutral sounding child migrants, which, sounds as if it's a behavioural category somehow, and sort of seems to be defining these people in terms of their behaviour, their migration, even though it wasn't a voluntary migration, rather than in terms of something that was done to them, and also defining them in terms of a particular moment in their lives. So I suppose I was wondering, partly thinking about, I mean, I think I've read stuff by Bain Atwood and people like that about the way in which the development of this term stolen generations kind of gave people who were members of that group a kind of new way of thinking about their own lives as something that wasn't peculiar to them. So I suppose what I'm really asking is this terminology kind of generally accepted, or is it challenged either by former child migrants themselves or by other people seeking other ways of describing them and describing what has happened to them? And if so, what's the kind of politics of that?
Fascinating question. In terms of the kind of organisation of these kind of former wards of state, you do have groups such as the Alliance for Forgotten Australians, and that does, I believe, cover all former wards of state. And they've kind of, I don't know about reclaim necessarily, because this isn't a term that they created themselves, it was kind of almost enforced upon them by governments or by charities. So it is generally accepted, although it's something of a bit of a, I don't know if I don't know, just kind of, the term child migrant, you're right, does kind of dilute what happened to them. Because I made clear this was a deportation they didn't choose, or it was done largely under false pretenses, so there wasn't any kind of voluntary notion of migration, but the charity is still called the Child Migrants Trust, so that's the kind of historical point of reference. They still use that term, and I think generally these terms are acceptable, although, as you imagine with the term forgotten Australians, many of them don't want to be considered to be forgotten. There's certainly a sense of, to a certain degree, maybe imposing victimhood or imposing kind of otherness on these children, but there's, in the general terms, kind of looking at kind of the, I guess, advocacy groups supporting these groups, they do use these terms, but it is certainly contentious. A lot of people, for example, are angry that Forgotten Australians is used to refer to all of these children when each of these groups suffered their own unique wrongdoings. You know, Indigenous child removal was a policy effectively is trying to erase by stealth First Nation Australians, and therefore to lump them in with this general group is a bit of a kind of oversimplification and quite a dangerous way of describing their unique experience in care. You know, and with child migrants having that kind of dual family separation, that loss of identity in both countries. So generally accepted, although there is certainly debate as to whether the term Forgotten Australians is kind of an enforced term to describe Australian-born non-Indigenous wards of states. And certainly the term child migrant doesn't aptly describe what happened to them in terms of it being, these were child deportees, these were removed, these were deemed to be unwanted children. So generally, on a general level, yes, it's accepted, but there is certainly a lot of individual nuances and debates in terms of the, I guess, accuracy, for lack of a better phrase, of these terms.
Thank you very much. Thank you for some fabulous questions. Before I ask you to thank our wonderful presenters, I will make a small change to the programme, I'm afraid. So if you would like to stay in this room, you will be seeing visual media, whereas in the programme it's down as community co-production. If you would like to see the community co-production, you'll be going upstairs to the tree house. We have deliberately left you some time to move between the two if you do want to go see community co-production in the tree house or stay here for visual media. On that note, thank you very much to our two wonderful presenters. Thank you very much.